First, I want to thank you all for the invitation to be here. I regret that I'm not going to be able to stay for the entire program. I truly enjoyed the presenters this morning. I'm batting cleanup. I can't promise you that I'll hit a home run, but I'll try to drive all of you at least home. We'll see if we can do the best we can. A few things I'd like to say is I want to commend the United Waterfowlers of Florida and the partnership that they have with the state agency here. Coming from a not-for-profit, I realize the value of partnerships. I realize the value of volunteer-driven efforts, and you all have something special here in Florida. You have a great state agency, and I don't say that in every state I go to. I happen to come from a state in Missouri that had an exceptional state Fish and Wildlife Agency, and they had that because the people in the state of Missouri wanted that. And I certainly detect that you all value wildlife resources here in Florida. So I commend you for that. I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize Peggy Higgins and her husband Jimmy. Peggy is the most recent state chairperson for the state of Florida. And again, we're a volunteer-driven organization, and it's people that contribute their time, their talent, and their treasure that makes Ducks Unlimited and this whole conservation enterprise possible. So thank you all. And then the last person that I want to recognize, and you all have another treasure here, and you've got an RD in Brett Boehner, who covers this part of the state. And I've known Brett ever since I came to work for Ducks Unlimited. He's one of my favorite RDs, and he's also one of the more successful RDs. So I just, again, appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about something that's near and dear to me, and that's waterfowl, and particularly the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. All right, let me just say that prior to 1986, waterfowl management was carried on, but waterfowl management actually was based upon chasing waterfowl populations by changing regulations. That was a big part of what went on. There wasn't a lot of attention given to habitat and the demise of habitat. A lot of people in the waterfowl management profession just took it for granted that waterfowl habitat and wetlands were going to be destroyed, and we were just going to have to live with it. This led to an awful lot of bickering between states, between flyways. And in the mid-1980s, when waterfowl populations declined again, which they do, and we'll talk about that when we talk about this plan, there were people that said, look, let's come together, let's develop a plan that is continental in scope. Actually, the predecessor to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan was a U.S. Waterfowl Management Plan. It became pretty obvious quickly that it needed to be continental. So in 1985, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. It was drawn. It was actually signed in 1986 by the Secretary of Interior and the Minister of the Environment in Canada. A lot has happened since that time. And under this plan, there's been almost $4.5 billion spent by the federal government and its many, many partners, and almost 16 million acres of habitat have been conserved. Now, that's not to say that the job is done, and I'll illustrate that. The thing that occurred with the signing of that first plan is that we, for the first time, really gave very specific emphasis on habitat. It was a recognition that habitat was being lost. There were probably things that could be done if we would work together, and we put together the joint ventures that were the locally driven partner organizations that were to put the habitat on the ground in the high priority areas as identified in the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. Partnerships, we've heard that talked about this morning. I mentioned it in my opening remarks about the partnership between the waterfowlers and the state agency here. Absolutely essential, absolutely essential. And the North American Waterfowl Management Plan provided that rallying point for the partners to come together. And one of the things that plan did is it had an implied, it wasn't really an explicit reference, but it was an implied reference to the fact that this plan was designed to sustain waterfowl hunting. Part of the plan when it was designed and signed in 1986 was that there would be periodic updates to that plan. In 1994, that update that took place brought Mexico in as a partner, and it finally did, in fact, become a North American waterfowl management plan, not just a plan between Canada and the United States. In 1988, the plan was revised, or 1998, the plan was revised again, and in this particular time, it expanded. It started out as a waterfowl management plan. It was realized as we had gone through a little over a decade of this that the work that was done on behalf of waterfowl was important to a whole suite of other birds that were important to wetlands, shorebirds, water birds, wading birds, and the joint ventures who were delivering this program embraced the idea of going to all birds, and that was certainly a big move in terms of that update. In 2004, there was an emphasis placed upon using the science, because one of the things that was a product of this plan being put on the ground is we learned a lot. It was designed to be an adaptive process, and anytime you do an adaptive process, you make a commitment that you're going to monitor and you're going to learn. And when the update was done in 2004, the specific reference to the importance of this scientific underpinning was emphasized in that update. In 2012, when it came time, and you'll notice there's probably a fairly long period of time between the update in 2004 and the revision in 2012. And when it came time to update this plan, there were people in the waterfowl management community that said, we've learned enough, we know enough things, we see things on the horizon that tells us that we probably need to do a better job in this next go-around and actually refer to this as a revision as opposed to an update. And I'll go through that and maybe you'll understand that a little bit better in terms of what that meant. It meant basically that we're going to integrate harvest, habitat management, and the people who enjoy waterfowl in a more implied way than what we had done in the past. The waterfowl management business is dynamic. If you just take a look here at since the time that we've been doing waterfowl surveys and the breeding grounds in Canada and the United States, you can see great changes in these way these populations go. Interestingly enough, if you look at the long-term average and you look at the period of time for the last 15 or 16 years, we've been in the good old days. I can remember when I first started hunting waterfowl in the 60s, which was one of those really down periods. People used to talk about the good old days in the 50s. Well, let me tell you, the times that we're enjoying continentally right now in terms of waterfowl are the good old days, but they're not all good, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. When we got ready to do this plan and we're sitting here and everything is real good, one of the first questions that some of the people asked said, where's the fire? What's the worry? We got high populations of birds. The habitat conditions obviously are good enough to support this, so what's the worry? But when you look on the grand scale of things, we're continuing in key areas to lose habitat, and particularly on the nesting grounds. And some of the research that's been done, some of the assessment work that's been done has said that 75–80% of what drives waterfowl populations occurs on the nesting grounds. So when you look at what was happening in the nesting grounds, and we're losing wetlands, we're losing grasslands at a higher rate than they're being conserved, there's the fire, in my view. The other thing is that obviously the Mother Nature is being challenged every day by growing human populations, by demands for energy, demands for water, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. There is a great stress and an increasing stress on waterfowl populations and their habitats that we have to address, and we want to do that proactively instead of waiting after the fact and wringing our hands. The primary supporters of the waterfowl management enterprise for 75 years have been waterfowl hunters, and we're losing the number of waterfowl hunters, and I'll quantify that for you a little bit later on. And I was around in the early 70s when the first Earth Day came around, and anytime you did a public survey, the environment came up as one of the most important things to have consideration. I would submit to you today that concern and the disconnect between the human population and the environment is not what it was at that time. And budgets are tight. You've heard that mentioned this morning. State, federal budgets are declining, and you take declining budgets and lack of interest in environmental things, that's a bad combination. And we were aware of that as this plan was revised in 2012. You talk about waterfowl populations and why they're dynamic. Why are they dynamic? Look at what happens in their breeding areas. Then their breeding areas are dynamic as well. And those of us and those of you all who work in wetlands understand that one of the necessary evils of a good, productive, vigorous wetland is it's got to dry out now and then, and it's got to be disturbed in some way or another, either by nature or by mechanical and human means. And certainly that's the case when you look at waterfowl populations as depicted from the breeding ground surveys. And again, there's the average over time. And we've had pretty good waterfowl habitat during this time frame. But I would point out to you something here to keep in mind. This has come at a time when we've had extremely high amounts of precipitation across the prairies. It also came at a time that there were 7 or 8 million acres of conservation reserve grasslands that were created basically during this time frame that we're seeing lost at an alarming rate right now. So there's a lot of tensions that are dealing with habitat, particularly on the breeding grounds, but in other places as well. This is just an example of what I talk about. More and more and more we're seeing these wetlands drained, we're seeing them connected, seeing drainage systems, we're seeing underground tiles that are taking these wetlands off the landscape, and it's doing that in order to divert grasslands into crop production on the breeding grounds. Coastal marsh areas. You all live that every day here in Florida. I did my work at LSU, and arguably the Louisiana coast is an area that is the most important migrating and wintering waterfowl habitat on the continent, simply because parts of 3 flyways find their way into the Louisiana coastal area. When I did my research work in the mid to late 60s in Louisiana, and I described the coastal marsh area where I was doing my work, I said there's 4 million acres there. Somebody does a master's thesis at LSU today, they say there are 3 million acres of coastland. That's a pretty dynamic change of a system, and you reach a point to where the potential to recovery is almost lost. So we have key areas, the breeding grounds in the coastal Louisiana and others that are facing degraded habitat. One of the other things that is not particularly pertinent here in Florida, but it is pertinent continentally, is that when you look at the Central and the Mississippi and the Pacific flyways, wintering waterfowl have come to almost depend on rice culture. The Central Valley of California, we've done some extensive work out there. About 50% of the needs for waterfowl in Central California is met by rice. And the California takes care of 60% of the entire Pacific flyway population of waterfowl. Louisiana, as the loss of these coastal areas, the increase in rice. In Texas, the same thing. And the rice industry has moved its way up the Mississippi Valley. We talked earlier about the problems with scarcity of water. When it comes time to decide what to do with water in the state of Texas, to let it go down the Colorado River to feed the rice industry or divert it into San Antonio and El Paso and Austin, guess who wins? And the rice industry is on the verge of collapse in the state of Texas. And we're starting to see declines in other places. So not particularly important here, but the fact that these other 3 flyways are important to Florida and to the continent, it's certainly something worth mentioning. One of the other areas is that a very important production area is the northern boreal forest, particularly the western boreal forest of Canada and on into Alaska. We always thought that this was a pristine area. About 40% of the annual waterfowl production comes out of the boreal forest. And on years when the prairies are dry, it can run even higher than that as birds move in there and settle, and some of them are able to produce. But now we're starting to see encroachment with energy production, the taking of timber out of that boreal forest, and all of a sudden it's becoming worthwhile to do this. Ducks Unlimited is working with the Pew Charitable Trust in the boreal forest, and our goal over the next 20 years is to conserve a billion acres of that habitat. Half of that is to be conserved through perpetual protection, so it'll never be mined, it'll never be utilized. And then the other half, because Ducks Unlimited is not an organization that's anti-development, we're just an organization that's smart development. The other half of that needs to be developed in a sustainable and an environmentally sensitive way. And we're finding those partners up there, those oil companies and those timber companies, certainly willing to sit down and talk with us. As we looked at this revision of this plan, we also realized we had another issue that we didn't deal with in the mid-1980s, and that was the continued growing of lesser snow goose populations across this country. I mentioned earlier the rice industry. Snow geese have found out that they can make a living on waste rice. And when I was at LSU, we used to think that by the 1st of November, almost all of the continental population of snow geese were on the coast and utilizing that coast. And it was hard to make a living in that coast. It's not hard for a snow goose to make a living in a rice stubble field. So populations have increased, and what that has done is put tremendous pressure on the Arctic breeding grounds. And that in turn impacts other populations of wildlife. So as we developed this plan, we made sure that we understood that this was what was going on. I mentioned earlier the decline in waterfowl hunters. And there was a time where, as waterfowl biologists, you could just predict if the waterfowl population goes up in the spring, if the regulations are liberalized, waterfowl hunters are going to increase. We'd sell more duck stamps. It would just track. Whatever the population was, it would track. Obviously, you've seen earlier that we have been at 15 years of pretty liberal hunting regulations, some of the most liberal in my lifetime, and yet we've seen this decline. And this decline is 46% over the last 30 years or so. That's pretty alarming, and there's nothing that indicates that this is going to turn around. And in working with some of my colleagues in wildlife agencies around, they're seeing similar trends in things like even deer hunters. When I worked in the state of Missouri, we didn't worry about much of anything else because we knew we would always have 500,000 deer hunters, and they would help foot the bill, and we would probably always count on 100,000 turkey hunters. But the fear is that the decline in hunters in other places are occurring at this rate as well. So when we got ready to do this plan, again, the primary focus was we're going to integrate people into habitat and population management. And we have entitled this plan, People Conserving Waterfowl and Wetlands. I told somebody last night that those of us in the conservation community have a tendency to be introverts. Some biologists don't even like people, let alone be willing to try to work with them and try to understand that they're a part of this. I learned a long time ago in my career, especially having spent most of it in management and in administration, that it's all driven by people in the end. People decide whether or not waterfowl and wetlands are important enough to conserve and important enough to have on the earth. So this was the premise under which this revision started. And we said we're going to take a look at the whole waterfowl enterprise, and we're going to determine whether or not the vision that we've had since 1986 is the right one, or does it need to be modified. We're going to break down silos, and when I refer to silos, there were entities that dealt with habitat, the joint ventures. There were entities that dealt with harvest management, the flyway councils, the technical sections, the harvest management working group that has been in play for a long time, done great work, but they all worked basically separate from one another. And we, for the most part, after implying in 1986 that people were an important part of managing this enterprise, in 2012 we wanted to make it very explicit that they were, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. We're going to integrate the objectives. We're not going to establish objectives in this plan that set aside, and I'll illustrate that a little later on. We're going to understand that these environmental and societal changes have to be dealt with. They have to be faced. They have to be considered. And again, we're going to be more explicit in terms of dealing with the people aspect of this. So we ended up in this plan, there are three fundamental goals. And the first one is that we're going to shoot for abundant and resilient waterfowl populations to support hunting and other uses without imperiling habitat. And that issue of snow geese is the primary reason that that last phase is in there. Populations of waterfowl can achieve areas where they do imperil habitat throughout their range. So that's exactly why that verbiage is in there. The second one, of course, is what the waterfowl plan has been about all along, and that's wetlands and related habitats sufficient to sustain waterfowl populations at desired levels, but also places for people to recreate. The other part of this is a recognition that the wetland work that is done for waterfowl and other birds has ecological goods and services that are provided to people, referred to earlier on in the discussions today. Flood abatement, improvement of water quality, a whole variety of things that take place with the work that we do. And a part of this plan is we intend to utilize the value of those goods and services to reach out to a broader segment of the public to help provide and promote and pay for this waterfowl management enterprise, because they're getting benefits out of it and they need to be made aware of that. And then the other is very clearly, and again, the explicit aspect of people. We want to grow the number of waterfowl hunters. First thing we got to do is we got to stop that decline, and then we start to grow. But we also want to reach out to other citizens who enjoy and who benefit from the work that we do. And I'll quantify this for you. In the process of doing this, we talked about who is the next most logical segment of conservationists that we identify with in the waterfowl and the wetland world, and it's probably bird watchers, people who like to watch birds. And the real interesting thing about this that we found out is that there are about 16 or 17 million people a year who consider themselves to be bird watchers. 14 million of these people travel more than 20 miles from home every year to view ducks and geese, to view waterfowl. So the iconic species in the bird watching world is waterfowl. I mean, they're easy to see, they're pretty, they come in great numbers, and we need to take advantage of that, and this plan sets us up to be able to do that. Again, I talked about revisioning, and you can read this and you can see that in 2004, we talked about the purpose of this plan is to sustain abundant waterfowl populations by conserving landscapes. Not a mention of people at all. Again, we had even lost the implied mention of people. But in 2012, when you read that plan, the purpose of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan is to sustain North America's waterfowl populations and their habitats at levels that satisfy human desires and perpetuate waterfowl hunting, accomplished through partnerships guided by science. So again, it may be a little bit subtle, but if you take a look at and compare the two, it's a pretty dramatic change, and it's a great expansion of the commitment in this plan. And the three goals that I mentioned earlier, you can't really talk about these individually. And our hope is that the people in the waterfowl management enterprise understand they're integrated, and we start to see more of this talking back and forth. We're going to always need people who are specialists in habitat management. We're going to always need people who are specialists in managing populations and managing harvest. And we are making a commitment in here to better understand what drives people and how they develop their values. And again, if we don't have people, we don't have the habitat. And if we don't have the habitat, we don't have the ducks. So they are very much interrelated. There were a series of recommendations specifically that came out of this plan, develop and revise and reaffirm the North American Plan objectives. The North American Plan since 1986 has operated on an objective of restoring waterfowl populations or maintaining waterfowl populations at the levels of the early 1970s. Those were good times for waterfowl. If you could think back of that chart, those were good times. We had pretty liberal hunting regulations, and we said, hey, that's pretty good to do that. But the thing about that is that's a very empirical, stable goal, and we've talked about the dynamics of waterfowl, and their populations are going to fluctuate based upon habitat conditions, which are going to be determined to a great extent by weather. So we're going to look at that and say, is this set population level something that is important, or should we look at some sort of a range? we're going to integrate, and I talked about that already. We're breaking down these silos, and we're going to talk about all three of these objectives in the same way. We're going to redefine and revisit the primary landscapes, and that's where we're going to focus our attention. That's where we're going to try to put our dollars. That's where we're going to work with our partners to get that on the ground, and I'll illustrate that a little later on. We have been operating in a system since 1994 of adaptive harvest management. This is where you determine right up front what your objective is in terms of your harvest, and it's taken a lot of the angst out of discussions about harvest. One of the things that we've done in any kind of adaptive process, you come to learn some things about that, and we have learned that probably trying to chase populations with regulations is not necessary. Again, I mentioned earlier that the thing that drives populations are mostly determined on the breeding grounds. So we're gonna continue to operate that system. We're gonna continue to learn, and we're gonna modify it. We're gonna go outside the waterfowl hunting community to find support for this plan. We're gonna increase our adaptive capacity. We're gonna make more of a commitment to this, and in doing that, the main thing that we've been lacking on is in some areas we haven't committed to do the monitoring to see whether or not we're really achieving what we said we were gonna do. It's the first thing to go when budgets get tight is, well, that's research or that's monitoring. We can not do that survey for a while. A bad move in my opinion. And we're going to establish a human dimensions work group. I served on a hunter recruitment and retention task force about 5 or 6 years ago, and this task force made up a bunch of biologists like myself, and we stumbled around for about a year and really didn't get anywhere. And we ended up inviting some people in who had expertise in this arena. And all of a sudden, we started to find out that, industry has used research and social science to determine why people buy one kind of beer over another, or what makes people decide what kind of car they're going to buy. Why can't we use this same kind of research to try to figure out what drives people to be interested in conservation? And we've made a commitment to stand up this human dimensions group, and we're going to move forward with it. Again, all three of these things are tied together. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about the habitat, which is handled by our JVs and the National Science Support Team, or whether it's the harvest management, which mostly is driven by flyway councils and flyway technical sections, and then this new HD work group. They overlap, and the little IIC that you see in there where they overlap, this is a interim implementation committee that's been put together from the very best of the best across this country to take this plan and actually figure out how to put it on the ground. And Ducks Unlimited's chief scientist, Dale Humberg, is chairing this group. He's doing that through a partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where they're actually reimbursing DU for about half a day's time to lead this group. And I'm pleased to tell you, and it won't come as any surprise to you, Diane Eggman of the Florida Wildlife Department is serving on that group. And those of you that know Diane know that her counterparts across the country at that same quality, this is a group that's going to do good work. Again, I talked about the Human Dimensions group. They're coming together right now. We're finding out that there are a few of those people out there in the universities and in state fish and wildlife agencies and the federal government, and we're committed to moving this thing on down the line. This group is very formative. The other two groups that I talked about, the Waterfowl Harvest Working Group and the NSST on the JV side, are pretty mature, but these folks are going to catch up, and they're going to catch up fast. We made a commitment throughout the process of revising this plan that we were going to involve the stakeholders, and we have. We had a series of workshops before the plan was ever revised. We're going to continue through this implementation phase to go back to the stakeholders. There is a group of people right now taking a look at those plans or those objectives that I talked about, particularly the population objectives, to see if we need to revise those. And we're going to use adaptive management. We're going to use some of these new tools of modeling to follow this plan and to do the monitoring. And we're going to make an absolute commitment to make sure that we do measure whether or not we're successful or not. when we started the revision process, we had what we called a waterfowl summit, and we brought the waterfowl management leaders from state, federal agencies from across the country to Minneapolis, Minnesota. Ducks Unlimited hosted that, and it was actually in that summit that the decision was made that, yeah, we've got a problem here in terms of having habitat, harvest, and people management separated, and when they need to come together. And probably the next place to bring that together is the next update of the North American Plan. And that update evolved into a revision, as I've talked about. We're probably going to repeat that after this implementation team has done its work to say, here's what we think, and we're going to bring those folks together, and we're going to talk about that again, and then we're going to take it out to the public once the Human Dimensions group has done their work. One of the things that I'd point out is that that came out of this plan, when this plan started, we looked at mallard populations as kind of the iconic species. It was the most harvested, it was the most popular across the flyways, and we treated mallards in the continent as one. One of the things that has come out of this is that we have broken this population down into 3 units, one of which obviously is very important in this part of the world, in the eastern mallards, the western mallards in the Pacific flyway, and then we'll continue to deal with the mid-continent mallards in the other 2 flyways. We're going to look at multi-species management, and I'll show you a little later on that it's pretty important to understand, because all species, when you look at that how well we are as overall in terms of waterfowl species, you'll see that there's some species not doing quite as well. And again, I've already mentioned the fact that we're going to use modeling to drive this, but we're not going to let models dictate, because models don't always tell what people think, but they certainly do help inform that. Again, the HD tools we're new at, and we're designing some pilot efforts to try to figure out how we're going to make this work. We had a meeting at Ducks Unlimited last week, and we had a breakout session by region, and it was really interesting. I sat in the western region, which are mostly obviously Pacific flyway folks. They talked about, we were talking about this from the standpoint of Ducks Unlimited's new initiatives that are sort of based on trying to, our way of addressing this revised plan. And the folks out there said, we've got a place in San Francisco Bay that is very important to North American waterfowl. There's not very many waterfowl hunters there, but we can sell people in San Francisco that this waterfowl plan and that this initiative in the San Francisco Bay is important. So we're going to do that, some of that within our own organization. We need to figure out a way to quantify these ecological goods and services, because that is the hook to the people that maybe the general public. If you like clean water, you gotta like waterfowl management. You gotta like wetland management. And we've got to figure out a way to demonstrate the value of waterfowl and wetland resources more than just what hunters and anglers spend. That's the primary thing we use today. But there are so many other economic drivers that we need to deal with. And again, I'm gonna keep hammering the fact that if you're gonna do this stuff and you're gonna say you're gonna do certain things, you gotta make a commitment in this enterprise to do the monitoring. Okay, there's what it's all about. It's about waterfowl populations, it's about waterfowl habitat, and it's about the people who value these resources. And we're gonna bring them together. A few anchor points as this plan implementation begins to start. Obviously, waterfowl populations have done really pretty well recently. And this is, if you look at the last 15 or 16 years, not too bad. You look at mallard breeding populations over time. And again, the dynamic part of this. And if you look at what we said we were going to do in the original plan, we were going to maintain populations at the 70s level. If you look at that last 16-year period, there's the long-term average. But here's where we've been. Again, it looks pretty good from a continental mallard standpoint. Now, I will tell you, I'll just give a little brief pause here. I mentioned earlier the loss of CRP. I mentioned drainage in the prairies. The fact that we do not yet have a farm bill. Congress hasn't seen fit to pass a farm bill that will drive some of this stuff. There is a potential train wreck in the prairie grasslands in play. And so these good old days may not be able to be maintained. And again, there's the breeding population, and we look at it again. We're doing good under this plan, but let's not get complacent. Gadwall is another species, and you look at the long-term average, you look at the 1970s, we were actually content to have fewer gadwall. Well, there's what the gadwall across the country have done. Pretty good. And in some parts of the country, the gadwall is a very important bird to waterfowl hunters. The other side of the spectrum, though, when it comes to pintails, and we look at the long-term average of pintails, we look at where they were in the 70s, they were below the long-term average even in the 70s. Our goal is to bring those back up there. We haven't done quite as well there. We've put a lot of effort into trying to understand this, and the very simple thing that we've come to understand is that pintails are generally one of the first species to arrive. They like to nest in last year's residual vegetation, and if last year's residual vegetation was spring wheat and they settle in it, guess what happens the first part of their nesting season? They prepare the ground to plant the next crop of wheat. And pintails, unlike mallards that'll nest until their feathers fall out, pintails don't do that. They're not very good about re-nesting. So this is what's going on. And I'll tell you, one of the things that Ducks Unlimited has done is we've partnered with Bear Crop Science, and we have promoted the use of winter wheat, because winter wheat they plant in the fall, obviously, and when the birds arrive, it's the growth from the fall before is there, and then it continues to grow. By the time they harvest that, the birds have nested and they're gone. And there's over 2 million acres of winter wheat in Canada right now in the wheat growing range. We've worked with these folks to develop strains of wheat that won't frost heave in the winter, that'll overwinter. And again, those are the kind of things that you don't think about conservation organizations or agencies doing, but you got to be cognizant of what's going on out there in the world. You got to figure out how to work with them. And we got to bring pintails back. Another anchor point, again, I've already mentioned the fact of what's happened to waterfowl hunters across the continent. It happened sooner in Canada, but it's happening here, and we've got to deal with it. We've got to continue to understand and not get complacent about habitat conditions as they exist today. We're 15 years out of the last drought on the prairies. That's longer in my 45-year career. That's longer than we've gone at any time. You could almost predict that every 10 years you're going to have these cycles. And again, I showed this picture earlier. Show it again as a reminder. And again, as we revise these plans, as we integrate our efforts, we have to understand that the connectivity between the people, the habitat, and the ducks is there. These are the areas that are most important to waterfowl continentally. And that is not to say that there are not very important waterfowl habitat areas. There is in every state. Ducks Unlimited Board of Directors has a commitment that we do waterfowl habitat in every state in this country, because in every state there is a jewel of waterfowl habitats that's locally important, may not contribute significantly to the overall picture, but when we talk about from a continental standpoint with limited dollars, declining dollars, we've got to put these dollars where they get the biggest bang for the buck. The challenges that we're dealing with, I've mentioned it repeatedly, the budget issues, trying to get this linkage, the human linkage, caught up to date and very clearly integrated in is good. We've got to think outside the disciplines that we've thought of before. I want waterfowl population experts going forward, when they think about their work, I want them to think about how that impacts habitat, or how habitat impacts their ability, and how they're doing everything they do for people. The biggest challenge in any time is changing the culture, and the waterfowl enterprise has its own culture. We have been harvest oriented for the first part of my career. We've become habitat and harvest oriented, but we've not coordinated these, and we've got to start thinking differently. And I'm confident that we're going to. And we've got to continue to consider a broader range of stakeholders. So the message that I leave with you is that there's 3 parts to this waterfowl stool, and that's the populations, the habitat, and the people that decide whether or not those other 2 are important.